see all of you at today's seminar by Dr. Emily Moran from UC Merced. And I'll just say a few things about Emily. I've been aware of her research even while she was a graduate student. She's, I think of her as being a kind of being a scientist that really integrates empirical work with mathematical modeling or good statistical approaches really nicely. And so whenever I see a paper by her, I'm always interested to read it. She has her PhD from Duke University, and then she did a postdoc at the ETH in Zurich, which is a really wonderful institution to be doing a postdoc and spend time in Zurich. She went with Jonathan Levine there. And she's then did a postdoc at Tennessee, and I forget the name of the units, the mathematical version of NCEAS, and was able to further develop her mathematical interests. And so she's been at UC Merced about 3 years, and today she's going to talk about the research that I think that you've gotten started since you've been at Merced. So thank you very much for coming for a talk tonight.
Hi, thanks very much. So yeah, this is going to be a works in progress kind of talk, focusing on some of the work that we've been doing looking at the role of inter and interspecific variation in climate responses of Sierra Nevada trees, and particularly the role that evolution might play in things like climate change responses. So I'm first just going to talk a little bit about some of the potential responses that we might expect to changing environmental conditions and some of the processes that shape them, then go over some of the current lab projects, and then talk briefly about some of the implications of all this for management of forests. So of course this is probably preaching to the choir, but forests play a lot of important roles in things like carbon cycling and sequestration, in affecting the water cycle, so through how much transpiration is happening affects how much water is going into groundwater, for instance. They provide wood and other natural materials, provide habitat for a wide variety of wildlife, and of course things like recreational opportunities for humans. And climate has already shifted in ways that we know are important to trees. So this is an interesting set of maps from this Rapacciulo et al. Comparing sort of the end 30 or 40 years of the 20th century to the beginning of the 20th century. And although there's been a fairly even increase in average temperature across the state and in winter minimum temperatures, increases in annual maximum temperatures have been a lot more variable. There's also been kind of this gradient where Northern California has gotten more precipitation, Southern California has gotten less, which is translated into some divergent patterns in changes in climatic water deficit, which is sort of a measure of aridity that takes into account how the effects on evaporation of higher temperatures. So Southern California and much of the Sierra Nevada getting drier, but some areas of the state actually getting a little bit wetter. So a species might respond to these types of shifting climate in several ways. So you might have what's a more ecological response of migration or range shifts, where you have extinctions down at the end of the range is becoming less suitable, colonization of areas that are becoming more suitable. You might have local adaptation, so it could be if this is the past optimum trait value and this is the future optimum trait value, you're having shifts in the selective pressures that might be moving that population towards that new optimum, and if that happens, and that species may be able to persist in that area. And there's potential for interactions between the two. So for instance, if there's evolution in dispersal traits, that's going to affect the ability of species to migrate. And of course, how much movement you already have between populations affects the local genetic variation on which selection can act. So one way that I think about this in some of the sort of montane systems that we look at here is if we imagine we have a low elevation species and a high elevation species, and we have a warming climate, we would expect potentially both of these species to be shifting up in elevation. And within each species range, there may be local adaptation going on. So let's say we have a bunch of seedlings that these are sort of the climates in which they would do the best. So some do better in warmer, some do better in cooler, and you'd have sort of a selection where the ones that would do better under warmer conditions are the ones that survive. But if we look at this area where those species are coming together, there's a number of different things that could happen. So if this species has enough genetic variation that it has some individuals that do well under those warmer climates, it may be able to persist and even exclude some of the potential migrants coming up from this species, so basically blocking the range expansion of this one. Or you could have a case where nobody here is well adapted to the changing conditions, and maybe you have a lot of migrants coming up from this lower species, in which case you have an expansion of this red species basically taking over this area over time. So some of the factors that might affect these responses include the rate of change itself in relation to how much seed dispersal is going on. So can the species reach the areas that are becoming suitable? What's the level of pollen flow between populations and local genetic diversity? What are the establishment conditions like? So if the seeds can get to a newly suitable area, are they actually going to be able to establish, or are local competitors going to keep them from growing? And what's the mortality rate of adult trees? If you have too low a mortality rate, they may be shading out the more adapted genotypes or species of seedlings. But if it's too high, you may be lacking seed sources. So this has a lot of relevance these days as we think about some of the extensive tree mortality that occurred during the recent drought. So Forest Service has estimated that over 100 million trees died throughout the Sierra Nevada, and that this has been paired with some observations of things like a decrease in canopy water content, where you have higher mortality in those areas where the canopy water content dropped the most. And 2013 was estimated to be the driest year in 500 years, and some of these droughts are said to be the most severe in the last 1,000. So this is definitely a severe challenge to these tree populations. So some of the projects that we're doing look at this issue from a number of different angles. So there's sort of a genetic angle, so we're looking at trying to identify genetic loci that are associated with climate or with traits that we expect to be associated with things like drought tolerance. My PhD student Meng Jun has been working on that. We have a number of field projects going, so we've been doing things like measuring demographic rates, growth, and anatomical, so cellular level responses to natural climate variation, and have also been establishing some common garden experiments. My other PhD student, Jeff Lauder, has been working on some really interesting stuff with tree rings and tree cell anatomy in relation to that. And then we've also been developing an individual-based forest model that can incorporate genetic variation and perhaps things like disturbance to look at how might the trajectory of a forest change if we allow there to be evolution within the population, which most forest models don't allow for, versus if we don't, if we have a more traditional approach that has particular parameters for a particular species. And so my postdoc, Mylène Aubrey-Kientz, has been doing some great work on that. So our main target species I'm going to be talking about a lot are Ponderosa pine, Jeffrey pine, and western white pine. And so these are basically representing sort of a low, a middle, and a high elevation species. And so these are just showing different pine species and the elevations that they're typically found at, kind of in the middle of the Sierra Nevada near Yosemite. And so part one, we're looking at responses to climate variation in natural populations. So we've established a set of field sites along an elevation transect down here in Sequoia National Park. So these guys, actually I need to fix this, they're 0.8 hectares. There's one that's down in the range of Ponderosa, one at the overlap of Ponderosa and Jeffrey I, one that's up in the Jeffrey I range, and one that's at the overlap of Jeffrey I and western white pine. And we're looking to establish some replicate transects as well. So there's one we've started establishing here in Tahoe National Forest, and actually instead of here, our next one is likely to go sort of in the middle, but we're still talking to the Forest Service about that. And within each of these sites, we've been censusing the adult trees, measuring them, keeping track of mortality and so forth. We have seed traps set out sort of along the edges of a cross-shaped seedling transect. where we've been monitoring natural seed dispersal and seedling establishment. And then within these sites, we have 40 subplots in which we've planted seedlings. So I'll come back to that in a sec. But this is where the sites are, if you're familiar with Sequoia National Park. Is the lowest elevation one is down here at the bottom of Giant Forest, then this one here, then this one, and that one. So this one's up a trail towards Twin Lakes, I think is the trail name. And so just looking at the trees in these sites, between 2015 and 2017, there was pretty severe mortality. So the red here are the dead trees and the white are the living trees. And so you can see that there was a lot of mortality of smaller white firs and of larger Ponderosa pine and sugar pine. Basically no mortality of black oak, live oak, or cedar. And in fact, at both the lower elevation sites, we're seeing mortality greater than 5% in 2016 and or 2017 over multiple species. So this is, for each of these guys, this is the lowest, this is the second lowest site. This is the total number of trees at the beginning. This is overall mortality, and this is how many of the ones that we had originally died in 2016 and how many that were alive in 2016 died in 2017. So basically anything over 5% is really sort of notably high for adult tree mortality. Now, mortality was a lot less pronounced at higher elevations where the drought was less severe. Like in this case, it looks high, but it was just 1 out of the 4 that occurred in that location. But some of the changes in relative abundances hint at future shifts in composition. So for our lowest elevation site, black oak, by virtue of not dying, increased from 23% to 29% of the adult trees, and it makes up over 60% of the seedlings that are big enough to be tagged. And the Ponderosa pine declined to 23% and has very few seedlings present in the plot. And white fir also showed a mortality, and although it's still fairly abundant in seedlings, it's not nearly as abundant among the seedlings as it is among the adults. So this may be a site that's shifting to being more oak dominated. So we've been looking at tree growth rings as well for these sites. So this is looking at 20 individuals of Ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine per site, at least for the sites where both species are present. 2 cords per tree, and using WinDendro software and WinCell software to look at the widths of the rings and the different traits of the xylem cells. So in terms of the actual basal area increment, so basically the amount of basal area that's added per year, the sensitivity of growth to climate does seem to vary by species and site. We're still getting more data in, but for example, at this lowest elevation site, both white fir and Ponderosa pine show this decrease with climatic water deficit, whereas the patterns seem weaker or even sometimes a little bit U-shaped at that next highest site. This is looking at deviation from mean growth by year for different, for all the trees within that lowest elevation site that have been cored and for just Ponderosa pine. And what we've been finding is that the pines seem to be more sensitive. So they have more years in which greater than half of the trees are showing a change in one direction or the other away from that mean growth. Same thing for the next highest site up, where both the Jeffrey pine and the Ponderosa pine are showing more of these years where a lot of the trees are showing a big response. So beyond just the basic ring growth, this is really comes down to Jeff. We were wanting to look more at what's going on with that wood production, because the characteristics of these tracheid cells that transport water and that make up most of the wood can have a big control on drought resilience. So how wide these cells are, how much early wood versus late wood the trees are putting on, and so forth. So we were hypothesizing that the trees that are producing cells with thinner walls and larger lumen diameter, so the interior of the cell, they're going to be more hydraulically efficient. They can move more water, and these thinner walls would have a lower carbon cost than ones that have these thicker walls. You have to make less lignin in order to make each cell, but they're likely to be more vulnerable to hydraulic failure during drought. So they're maybe more likely to have cavitation when you have a lot of tension on the water column inside those cells that blocks off the transfer of water. So this is some data that we've collected so far. So first, Jeff was looking at 2007, which was sort of a moderate drought versus the year before and after. And there are some shifts in how the trees are building these cells during versus before and after the drought. And then this is within this most recent drought, 2011, 12, and 14. And somewhat surprisingly, we're finding that the pines that survived until 2016, which is the sort of solid blue line here, seem to actually have lower wall thickness and a less steep increase of wall thickness with lumen diameter than the trees that died, which is actually sort of the opposite of what we were expecting. And all of these are significant, but as you can see, there's a lot of scatter, so it's not a great predictor. The survivors also had more dense tracheids than the dead trees and higher maximum ring widths. So they seem to be growing more than these guys that died. So we're starting to dig into some other factors that may be influencing some of this. So the anatomy of the tracheid pits, so the little holes that connect up the water conducting cells, can also affect vulnerability to cavitation, so how much air can sort of get sucked in through those holes, basically. We're also looking at things like whole tree carbon allocation trade-offs. So if the tree is investing in these thicker celled tracheids, there may be other things that they can't do. They may be able to allocate less towards root growth or towards reproduction, for instance. There may also be some kind of role of competition. So we do have information on where each of these trees is in relation to the other trees in the stand. Maybe some of the trees that are experiencing high competition are doing something different from the ones that are experiencing low competition. One of the other interesting observations that came out of this is that growth in survivors seems to be more consistent across years than the growth in the ones that died, which then sort of like, all right, so are these guys actually experiencing that drought stress or not, or do they just have kind of more of a slow and steady kind of growth strategy compared to some of the others that have sort of more of a boom and bust type of dynamic? So that's something that we're exploring. We've also, because of course it takes some time to build up useful amounts of data on mortality and whatnot, have been making use of some great long-term data sets that have been collected by the USGS in Sequoia, Kings Canyon, and Yosemite National Parks. So these are about 30 sites that were established between 1982 and 2001 and have been maintained up to the present. Adult mortality is measured every year, diameter at breast height every 4 to 5 years. This is sort of Nate Stevenson and Adrian Dass's work, and for 26 of those plots, there are yearly seedling samplings that were carried out from 1999 until 2008, so about 10 years of seedling data from a grant written by these folks. And so looking at that, one of the things that pops out is, so these are climate PCA analysis, including snow depth, precipitation, climatic water deficit, January minimum temperature, average temperature, and July maximum temperature, with each of these dots being a different year and these circles representing different plots, is that there's a difference in temperature that tends to be more across plots or elevations, whereas there's a lot of variation in precipitation year to year, but less so along this elevation gradient. And so this is what most of these sites look like. Most of them are about a hectare, and they include these 25 meter by 25 meter seedling sampling squares, which are divided into 5 meter quadrats. And within each of those 5 meter quadrats, the number of first year, second year, and older seedlings in several size classes were recorded, and seedlings greater than 10 centimeters were given a numbered tag and tracked individually. So we've been doing a number of models based on these data sets. So this is one that I worked on with my postdoc Milan, in which we're trying to infer what the DBH of the trees are, what their diameter is every year. They're not measured every year, but because we can look across these different sites and get an idea and sort of draw strength across different observations, we can infer what's going on based on that observed DBH, and we can include both things like observation as error as well as various parameters that might be associated with that growth process. And so this is showing for individuals of each of our four most common tree species that these red dots are our observed diameters, the X's here are the predicted diameters. And so you can see our uncertainty goes down, of course, in those years where we have an actual observation, but it's doing pretty well at predicting what size these trees are. And so what we're finding is that in terms of their growth rate, trees that were larger had a positive effect, right? So bigger trees were growing faster. Competition had a negative effect. So if you had more large neighbors, you grew slower. And then the climate effects are kind of interesting. So we also have a species level effect. So some of the species just tend to grow faster than the others. And so this is average annual temperature in the previous year. So this is one of our better predictors. And here there seems to be a little bit of an elevation effect with some of these lower elevation species like the live oak and the Ponderosa pine having a negative effect of warmer previous year, and those at higher elevations being more likely to have a positive effect of warmer previous year. This is deviation from average snow amount in the current year, and again, the only places you're seeing sort of negative effects are some of these higher elevation species. The interpretation of these is a little bit more complex because it's showing some negative effects of current year total precipitation or deviation, positive effects of climatic water deficit deviation. So you'd expect it to be kind of the opposite. And I'm suspecting that these guys just may be correlated with some other environmental factor that we didn't have access to. But these guys are really our strongest predictors. And some of those lag effects, so those climate in the previous year, you can see the effects looking at 2 years in particular, 1999, which was a cool dry year preceded by a warmer wet year, versus 2010, which was a cool wet year preceded by a warmer dry year. And you can see that 1999 growth is predicted to be bigger for all of these species, but the difference depends on your species identity. We're also looking at modeling environmental effects on things like fecundity, adult mortality, seedling mortality, and growth. And these parameter estimates are being incorporated in SORTI, which is an individual-based stand model originally developed for eastern North American forests. And so this is trying to get our basic species level parameters for Sierra Nevada species working in that framework. So part 2 here, looking at variation within species in their climate responses. So there's a lot of older provenance studies or seedlings that from one area have been planted in other areas that have revealed that many tree populations are locally adapted, performing better in conditions that more closely resemble their home environment. So this is an environmental transfer distance. 0 would be the same mean annual temperature, for instance, as your home environment. This would be cooler, this would be warmer. And there may, in some cases, be some maladaptation. So sometimes populations at the warmest end of the range might do better in conditions that are slightly cooler than where they came from, which may be due to either evolutionary lags or gene flow from the central areas. But a lot of these earlier studies looked at relatively short transfer distances because they were mostly concerned with where should foresters plant certain seed sources to get the best yields. And so they weren't necessarily trying to explore what happens across this whole climate space, but rather to find what's going to grow best in a particular location. So we're doing a seedling planting experiment in which we're sourcing seeds from various latitudes and elevations to represent the full climatic range of these species. And so we're looking first at when genotypes or species are moved to warmer environments, what happens? If their performance, their survival and growth is worse than in climates that are similar to their home, then we would expect warming climate to negatively impact those species. And if they are able to survive and grow at sort of similar rates to some of the local species and genotypes when we move them up to cooler environments, then it may be that in some cases they already have the ability to expand their range into these new areas, at least if the seeds can get there. And their performance relative to some of the local species may tell us something about why they're not there already. Because if they seem to be competing well with some of the local species, then it may be a seed limitation issue where they're just not dispersing into those areas. Whereas if they really are growing slower, even if they're surviving, it may be that they are just experiencing too much competition to colonize those areas, even if the seed is reaching it. And so we're going to be planting out seedlings of our 3 target species at all 4 sites. These are our 4 sites within Sequoia National Park, and these are the home climates of the seedlings of the different species. Now, one thing that pops out about this, so we planted these guys already. They were grown in the Placerville nursery for us. We put them out this spring. And one thing to notice is there's a surprisingly large overlap in the climates these guys are coming from for Pinus ponderosa, for example, and Pinus monticola, which at least in the southern Sierras are never found together. So it seems weird that you have some of these guys coming from such warm, dry areas. And so to make sure there wasn't just something weird about the location information on the seed sources, we looked at a different data set, so the CalFlora presence data set, and found again that there was this surprisingly large amount of overlap. So here the orange is Ponderosa pine, the purple is western white pine, and the blue is Jeffrey pine. And again, there's this huge overlap where you just really don't find these species together. But if we divide it up between points that are from the northern half of the Sierra Nevada versus the southern half, that overlap is decreased. So we're pursuing this now using some FIA data, which has both presences and absences and can allow us to check whether there actually are co-occurrences. And there are like 9 sites in the state where you can find both Ponderosa pine and western white pine, and they're all in the far north. But what we're seeing for all 3 pines is that the northern populations tend to occupy warmer but wetter conditions than do the southern populations. And so this may be a case of local adaptation in these species, perhaps constrained by the presence of other pines. So what I'm thinking is that, so for example, Ponderosa pine as a species clearly has the ability to live in all of these climates, and presumably given enough time these populations could adapt to live here. But if other species are already present and are occupying that area, then they may not. And so since these areas were not as completely glaciated as some places in the eastern North America, these multiple pine species may have just kind of been moving up and down the mountains together rather than having this case where they're having to colonize entirely new areas and maybe having more opportunities for local adaptation that's not constrained by their competitors. So we tagged a bunch of seedlings with little bird bands to indicate which were our seed sources, planted them out 12 at a time in these sort of 1 meter by 1 meter quadrats. And we've looked at first summer survival. We've gone back to look at these guys in the fall, and it was really variable. So this is going from our lowest to highest elevation site. The lowest and highest actually had the highest overall survival. And oftentimes it was the Jeffrey pine that was the one that had the highest survival, rather than it being Ponderosa surviving most in the Ponderosa site and Monticola in the Monticola site and so forth. So we've been looking a little bit more closely at what was determining who lived and who died. So across planting sites, at least for these 3, it does appear that your maximum survival is higher if it's sunnier. So this is canopy, a measure of canopy openness. Although it didn't seem to matter so much at this site. And we've been playing around with some initial survival models. So this is one that included probability of survival as being a function with a logit link of their site identity, the distance climatic distance from the source population, and canopy openness. So this one particular site had a strong negative effect on survival. Canopy openness had a positive effect. These were much weaker effects, but they did tend to lean in a particular direction. And what was popping out is that there are these sort of weak moisture transfer distance effects. So this is climatic water deficit, this is precipitation, but no temperature transfer distance effects are showing up yet. And I'm wondering if that's going to change after the winter. So we'll be following this up over the next few years, and also trying to have replicate plantings at those 2 new transects that we're establishing. Third, we've been looking at linking genetic variation to phenotypic variation and climate gradients in Ponderosa pine. And this would be using SNP markers. So the single nucleotide polymorphism, so these are areas where individuals may differ by a single base pair. And these are good because you can have lots of SNP markers across a genome, and more so than some of the older types of genetic markers, and can associate variation at those loci with things like phenotype, or with what types of environments the individuals are found in. So basically what you're looking for is a location where you have a stronger association of, do you have, say, an A or a T with, say, aridity than you have on average. So our first step is sampling from a Ponderosa pine genetic orchard that's in Chico, California. So these trees they're clones that were collected in the 70s and planted out there. So we know what the original location of that genotype was. So there's a latitude and longitude from which it came. And so what we found is that these guys basically are representing the center of the climatic range in terms of temperature and aridity of Ponderosa pine in California. So it'd be nice to get the full, but it's a pretty good resource. You've got a decent gradient in there. And they're now reproductively mature, so we're going to be able to collect seeds from these different mother trees. So we have the needles from 200 of those individuals. We've been doing genotyping by sequencing to get SNP genotypes. They're kind of randomly scattered through the genome for those guys. We also are interested in trying to do a more targeted sequencing to make sure that we have more SNPs that are actually inside genes. That's going to involve doing a little bit of RNA sequencing to get some sort of preliminary transcriptome data. And then our plan is to do genotype to environment association. So basically trying to find loci for which the allele frequencies vary along environmental gradients, particularly aridity. And we're also currently testing some techniques to do a greenhouse drought response experiment. So we take the seeds of these trees and plant them in dry and wet conditions and measure a variety of traits like root to shoot ratio, the gas exchange versus photosynthesis, and other kinds of traits that we expect to be involved in drought tolerance. Try to find the loci that are associated with that. And so if you have something where you have a trait that seems to be predictive of survival and growth in the drought condition, and you have a locus associated with that trait, if that one also shows up in your genotype to environment association, that suggests that that might be a trait and a locus that may be under selection actually out in the field. So this is, we're working on this in collaboration with David Neal's lab and the Genome Center at Davis, and trying to get that going. And so finally, is trying to integrate and makes predictions based on some of this stuff using simulation models. So I was interested in the extent to which the potential for evolution in a tree species could shape their responses to climate, because that's sort of been has not had much attention until recently, because it was assumed that tree generation times are just too long, it wouldn't matter. But they also have a lot of genetic diversity, and there's a very strong selection at the seedling stage. Most seedlings don't make it to adulthood, that could actually have some kind of impact. So it did a little toy model where we had a low elevation species and a high elevation species that could have these simple genotypes that determined how well they did in different climate categories. And we did find that, yes, whether the degree to which you had local adaptation, the amount of variation within these species did seem to have an effect on the rate of shifts and how what sort of interactions happened at those range boundaries. So that was encouraging. So we've now been, as I say, working on this sortie project. So this is a much more detailed forest model that actually tracks what's going on with individuals. And our strategy here is to have each individual have a different parameter for its response to, say, temperature, how temperature affects its survival, for instance. And then to have that be heritable, to have the parameter that its offspring have be dependent on what the parent's parameter is. So this is something that Milan has been working on a lot, and that we're starting to get some useful new functions going in this model. And so we can then, once we have this completed, run these simulations under, say, increasing temperature scenarios and see what happens to the forest composition if we don't allow for evolution, if we do sort of the standard species level parameter approach, versus if we have this heritable variation within populations. How much does that change the outcome? So I said most of that. So what does all this mean for how we're going to manage forests in the future? Well, one thing we know is that a lot of common tree species have high genetic variation within populations, and this high genetic variation does seem to enable them to adapt to a wide range of climates. So there is local adaptation within these species as well. Also, adults can often persist through periods of adverse climate. So as long as it's short, oftentimes the adults will survive. They may not reproduce during that period, but they will afterwards. Dispersal distances that are too short relative to the rate of change, competition, and long generation times, though, could lead to lags in either range shifts or adaptive responses, or both in a lot of tree species. So it can be 20 years between when a seedling establishes and when a tree starts to reproduce, for instance. And those types of lags could lead to lower fitness of populations and potential loss of ecosystem services. So there have been a number of interventions that are being considered that involve seedling planting, which is something foresters do a lot anyway. It just would be how do you change where and how you're sourcing your seeds. So long distance assisted migration, we're basically taking something from its current range way out to where you're projecting future conditions will be suitable, is something that doesn't have a ton of support either from those who are comfortable moving seeds around versus those who are worried about things like whether these guys could become an invasive species, right, if you make these long distance jumps. Even those who are like the idea of assisted migration are like, well, this might not even work. We're not worried that they're going to become invasive. We're worried that it's just going to be a waste of time and money because they're all going to die. This climate's too different still. So a couple of the approaches that are being considered are short distance migration. So you're just taking things and just moving that range edge a little bit, speeding up what you would expect the natural process to be, or assisted gene flow within the range, where you're maybe, when you're restoring a population here, for instance, having some local seed, but also bringing in things from lower elevations or lower latitudes that might have useful alleles for the future climate. And so there have been a number of sort of practical and simulation effects to try to figure out the risks versus the benefits of these types of approaches. So this is one from Aitken and Whitlock, which was looking at what happens if you have outbreeding depression. So this is where having gene flow from another population has a negative effect on fitness because you're bringing in alleles that are locally maladapted. And finally, well, all right, you could have a drop in fitness of a bit, but if there really is strong selection against some of these alleles, you're going to purge those out without too much time. And if you bring along alleles that are actually advantageous as well as disadvantageous, then the advantageous effects could swamp out the bad effects. And it might still be worth it. So the question is, how often is that the scenario? Canada, though, is actually already moving ahead with assisted migration. They've changed some of their recommendations for where seeds should be sourced when you're doing a replanting. So British Columbia and Alberta extended their seed transfer zones 200 meters higher. So you're sourcing your seeds from 200 meters either downhill or 2 degrees further south from where you're going to be planting them. And so they're doing kind of like a practical experiment here. It's not something that US land managers have yet embraced, but it could be an interesting example to look at of how well that works. And so some of the things that I'm interested in looking at are, what are some of the implications of the climate change we've already observed? So are there areas that have already become suitable for some of these species, but we just haven't seen that range extension yet, either because of seed limitation or competition? How necessary is it to do this type of assisted migration? So doing things like looking at how far seeds can disperse, and are these populations likely to be able to move fast enough on their own or not? And are there sort of habitat modifications that might increase this sort of ability to move or adapt? So thinning, for example. If we choose non-local seed sources when we're restoring areas, what should the source populations be? Can we base that just on the climates they're from now? Is it better to use sort of a marker-assisted approach? And to what extent do we need to include evolution in our projections of climate change responses for trees? Are we going to get it wrong if we don't allow these populations to evolve? And so this is just a photo from our lowest elevation site, and it does seem like a much more pressing issue, because these guys do play an important role in carbon dynamics, and if we're having large-scale mortality like this, we're obviously losing a large carbon sink. Some of these forests can become carbon sources during these type of die-off events. And if we lose too many too fast, then we may not have the opportunity to get in naturally some of those better adapted species or genotypes. So thank you all for listening, and I'd like to thank various PhD students, undergrads, lab techs, funders, and collaborators who have assisted with this work. Yes.
So from part one, you have a lot of lag effects in terms of things that are predicting your mortality. And I was wondering if you think those are actual lags, or is it just a delay in picking it? Like, is it
for the growth model.
Time interval, or
For the growth model, well, actually, it does seem like some of the climatic conditions in the previous year, there's good reason to think that that's a real effect on the growth. So, for instance, a lot of the growth is happening in the early spring. They haven't had time to photosynthesize a lot yet. So, if the conditions were good for storing up carbon in the previous year, for instance, then we might expect that to have a positive effect on growth in the next year.
Mm-hmm. So you think that those probably are real lag effects?
I suspect so, that both in some cases the water availability or the availability of other resources like stored carbon can easily be influenced by what happened in the previous calendar year.
And then just one other quick, is there any interplay with natural enemies at these lower sites here? Because
with the growth, I don't know. We haven't had a chance to look at that. Certainly for mortality, we would for a lot of these trees recently, sort of the most proximate cause of death is things like bark beetle. But of course, they're more vulnerable to that when it's dry. So far, we've been mostly been looking at it as just a different kind of drought mortality. But there could be other things that, like the dynamics of the spread of the beetle, that certainly could affect that a bit, of whether that's an accurate way of looking at it or not. Yeah,
it'd be interesting because there is some prediction, as I understand it, that you might expect, for example, like wood density to relate to susceptibility to some of those kinds of things, so you might have some
yes, and that's something. So Jeff and I are working on another review article that's sort of going to be his first dissertation chapter, in which we talk about some of those trade-offs of allocation. That one of the things that you could allocate to is defensive stuff, like defensive chemicals, having denser wood, as you say. And when is it better to allocate to that versus to, say, reproduction? Something we're calling fight or flight, of that most of the time for a tree you'd expect, if resources are limited due to a stressor like drought, that they would be concentrating on surviving that stress because they're long-lived species and they're going to have other chances to reproduce later if they can survive this event. But there might be a tipping point where the stress goes on long enough that the probability that that tree is going to die is high enough that it makes more sense fitness-wise for them to switch and put their resources into reproduction. And anecdotally, there's some evidence of that. And we may even be seeing some of it because this year seems like a huge year for sugar pine cones. And yeah, we did have a wet winter, but sugar pine cones take 2 to 3 years to mature. So they were starting that reproductive bout in the middle of the drought. And so they may have lucked out that they got some water this year, but that could be one of the sort of like drought-induced masting things that you do occasionally see in trees.
The growth function curves, have you done those yet?
No, this is too recent.
Thinking, and which of your experiments are you thinking you'll be able to? You want to generate those kind of curves. Which of your experiments you think will generate them? And are you going to do them on seedlings?
So that would have to be the seedlings that we have along the gradient, right? So because nothing else has transfers yet. Except maybe for some of those Chico orchard things, but as we were discussing the other day, I'm a little bit worried that they cut out the slower growing ones, and so
we know they did.
Yes. So, and then those were shorter transfer distances anyway. But yeah, we're hoping that for the survival and growth, we can get basically more of that curve, because there's a wider range of climatic transfer distances that are represented in this experiment.
You know that those figures looked familiar to me, like the away ones that we've seen published over and over again.
Yeah, that one was from a Leites et al. Paper from 2012.
But most of those curves are based on studies that did remove the slow-growing trees.
Yes.
So almost all the provenance studies, and they do that, they're looking at what are the best growing trees.
Mm-hmm. I'm just
becoming aware of that and trying to figure out what's the implication of that.
Right. So I don't know whether that would tend to amplify the effect. It might, relative to if you were just thinning them at random, because you're looking at sort of like what is the maximum possible growth for that source in that location.
I'd love to talk to you more about it, because I can't decide whether it amplifies it or it should actually make the differences between source sites less, because you're always picking the best growing trees.
Right. It could go either way, depending on how much the ceiling varies, basically. Yeah.
Could you go back to that one table? That table, because you went over it and I just wasn't fast enough to keep up with you. Where you're
with the climate effects, or with
you had different colors, and I was not. I guess I'm asking you to go way back, but I was interested in what it was. That one.
This one, yeah.
So I don't understand what that table was showing.
So the red and the green are whether it's having a positive or negative effect on growth in a given year. So whether this mean annual temperature in the previous year, if it's green, then if it was hotter in the previous year, they grow more. If it's red, then they grew less. And some of these are now these are all relatively subtle effects. You can see they're pretty small.
What's the species effect? What's that?
So this is just basically the intercept for this species. So if it's bigger, then that's a species that was tending to grow more. If it's smaller, that's a species that tends to grow less than average. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. It's very.
Yeah, and so like these guys are the ones like, okay, this makes sense what's going on with this. These guys, some of these precipitation and climatic water deficit effects are sort of in the opposite directions that I would expect. And it's not just that you might be having some trade-offs with these guys because there's 4 different climate variables included in this model. Even when we had single ones, some of them were in an unexpected direction. And I think there's a couple of things that could be going on with that. One is that, as I mentioned to somebody today, there are some issues about whether this climate model is calculating climatic water deficit correctly. The maps look like they make sense of areas that you would expect to be having. If they have low precipitation and or high temperature, you're getting more evaporation and you have a higher climatic water deficit. But they also depend on things like soil depth, and those are things that could vary throughout the state and how good those estimates are. And for precipitation, this has also been showing up as something that's not always a positive effect on survival in seedlings. And for the seedlings, I'm suspecting that there could be some pathogen effects, because this has also been seen in forest species where, yeah, the tree likes more moisture, but so do the fungi and things that might be attacking them. And so in some cases it might actually flip that effect. I wouldn't necessarily expect to see that for adult growth, but it could be that, you know, this is associated with some other thing that we're not measuring to explain why some of these are showing a negative effect.
Well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank Emily for presenting a very, very exciting research program, and thank all of you for coming.